So yeah, something like there's tons of experts. It's very grounded in like what people are already thinking about in the history, and very humble. So there's a practicality to it, but at the same time knowing like chances are this particular idea is not going to be the thing, or this particular mental model is not going to be what gets enacted in the world, but it's the prototype, which then gets iterated on by future people. Like, and maybe the future people is us. Maybe we decide like, oh, we want to build a company out of this, but it doesn't matter. Someone else could. And the idea is like right now, there's this thinking, this synthesis, this idea has already been like this frontier has been pushed.
Exactly. Illuminated.
Yeah, it's not complete darkness. There's a candle here.
Yeah, and so if you have like the luminaries, like you have the pioneers who are out here finding new nodes in like what was previously the unconscious, and then you're collectively in relationship about them in ways that create new neural networks in collective mind. It's like you don't have to have an intention. You don't have to have an intention to shape how things collectively unfold and collectively manifest. You're just illuminating new potentials and then bringing the bringing the potentials that are made possible from those illuminations to collective awareness and seeing what the consequence of that is.
Yeah, there's a quality of being in relationship with unfolding or reality experience where you're like, all right, here's some stuff, and this is the beginning. This is the first step in the dance move, and now we're in dialogue with civilization in a certain sense. So yeah, like I'm trying to think of other, just like the widest range of examples. Like, okay, like how do we end sex slavery? So this just doesn't exist anymore on the planet. And like, it's like, okay, here's what's required, and then you put it out there, and people are like, hey, you forgot to address that. Like, here's the main incentive structure, and here's how secret police, blah blah blah, blah blah blah, and like here's what's already been done. You're like, great, thanks. Now that we've included that, here's the new suggestion, and then someone else is like, all right, now I'm ready to try it, and they try maybe they try a less good version of it. It's not fully complete, and you're like, great, like that's not what we have envisioned. It's probably not going to work this way, and maybe you're even right, or the way we predicted it doesn't quite work. But they've now taken another step into the concrete realm that is now research that feeds into the.
You're like codifying collective intelligence.
Yeah.
And each experiment informs the unfolding of the larger we game.
Yeah.
Which is solving humanity's deepest problems and freeing our resources that are already here. We just haven't quite finagled our way out of the way.
Well, when you say that, like solving the deepest, what I think of as humanity as one entity, metaphorically at least, like where my shadow material, like almost categorically, I can't know how to resolve it. I have to be in relationship with it. So I have to be like in this kind of surrendered mystery. Like there's a thing here, and I'm discovering it. I'm ashamed of it. I don't know what it means. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know how to release it. I don't know how to heal it or alchemize it or embrace it or whatever it is. But I come into intimacy with it, and where humanity. This is what we're suggesting is humanity is doing that by saying like sex slavery is a good example. It's something that I don't think about very much. It's embarrassing as a species that we still do this.
Totally.
So it's like, right, we're going to come into more contact with this as a species, and we don't quite know what it's like in that same metaphor, shadow.
Yeah, and so like, I mean, when you say sex slavery, I'm like, where I go initially, just to play with this in the moment, is like, I go, okay, so what are the core underlying parameters that would need to get solved / supported for this to be a non-phenomena anymore, right? So like on the one hand, it's like for the children or the human beings who get put in sex trafficking for financial reasons, like they need to have access to ways of having income that come from a different source than sex trafficking. And then for the people who purchase sex trafficking, they need to have access to sex through a different medium. Like they need to be able to still get that need for sex met, but not through or through a different channel. So whatever like capacities need to be developed, like interpersonal skills, or like if there's any like lack of, like if there's any scarcity from lack of access or whatever, like that's got to be fleshed out. So even just that, like just 2 parameters, one being financial for the people who are like selling people into sex trafficking and getting paid to sell people into sex trafficking, and then for the people who are on the purchasing end to get that need for sex met in a different medium, like that would just be like an initial kickoff point into that kind of thing.
Right, and exactly. That's part of it. So it's like, it's hard to. It's a good example of like, oh, here we're facing the collective shadow or personal shadow or whatever around sex, or around, especially if it's sex slavery. A lot of times it's like underage. So now we're talking about like symbolisms of innocence and like probably early childhood abuse and things like that. So there's a lot to really think through the problem in this kind of holistic 4-quadrant approach. Yeah, it's going to be deeply confronting, which I think is part of why people don't do it, or part of why like the current answers aren't working, is because it's not fully facing the whole issue.
Right. It's still seeing the issue as a symptom that needs to be solved instead of getting to the root.
And there still will be some solving. There still will be some like working with law enforcement, or whatever it is, funding for whatever the thing that needs to happen is. There's all sorts of, and I mean, but that's part of the thing that's exciting about the think tank bit. It's like, well, let's get the ball rolling. Like all that stuff is so hard to really make happen when you also still have to think about the whole thing, and like, so it's like, well, let's get like 10 balls rolling, and then we can come back around, or someone else can come back around and say, right, they've thought through this, but you know what? I'm not a big thinker, but I'm a good person at getting funding, or I'm really good at executing when somebody comes up with a plan. And so, yeah, it's lucky that we have all these plans created.
I feel like we haven't explicitly said this, but we've talked about it implicitly the whole time, which is like there's a media component to this, which is like almost like grabbing a megaphone and speaking to the world and speaking to collective mind and saying, this is what we see, this is what we sense, this is what we're learning. And like people, there's a feedback mechanism where people are like hearing that, going out and playing with something, and then coming back and sharing, like, here's what we learned, or here's how it went, etc. And there's some kind of like, I mean, in this way that I'm describing it, there's sort of like a guy standing in the town center with a microphone who's taking the learnings and reporting, but also there's, through software or through AI or some type of technological intelligence mechanism, there's a way that those insights could be distributed through the network, like network intelligence.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking about the UN development goals, like the original version, which was like 16 goals instead of like 1,000 goals or whatever, when there was like something actually useful because you can coordinate effort.
Yeah.
And there's something interesting where it's like, the UN development goals are like step 1, and we're saying like let's take steps 2 through 10 or something. And
we already have step 2, which is emerging probabilities. We got a better, you know what those are, right?
What are emerging probabilities? So
I took about 5-6 years ago, I created a list of the top problems in the world, and I took those, and I took the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I turned all of them into this list that I call emerging probabilities that temporarily seem impossible.
Right.
And it's all the creative, possibility-oriented outcomes of what we actually want to see happen, not like issues to solve, but the world we actually want to live in.
Beautiful, yeah.
And that was actually what gave birth to Light in Action in our emerging future, was like finding people who are embodying that vision now and going, how do we support them? So we got at least one step beyond.
That's beautiful, exactly.
At least one step beyond it.
That's it. And yeah, there's this kind of interesting combination of like both zooming out to say, okay, well, like if it's like coral reef, like let's say the coral reefs or something, like we want to zoom out, like what are we trying to get from that? What's that for? Like in a way, going deeper.
Right.
And then also being being more specific in some ways. Like we're also zooming in a little bit, and so I think that like part of like maybe step 3 or step somewhere on the path is right. Like there's something that this is the UN Sustainable Goals like plants a flag, and it's like let's just self-organize now, like around it. Like stuff's gonna happen, it's gonna be cool, like yay. And then I think this is us. We're like yeah. Okay, we're gonna have to pause. But yeah. Oh, my mind is everywhere.
My mind is everywhere.
Yeah,
this is true.
We're like, okay, let's put out, like, let's not just say, hey, here's a place to go. Let's hopefully we'll get there. We're saying here's a place we think we want to go, and here's a way that we think it's possible to get there. That's pretty robust and inclusive or kind of like multifaceted, hyper object aware.
Yeah.
And then we're in dialogue. So with the kind of bottom upness. So there's actually more like in a way the UN development goals were too bottom up. Like there needed to be more myofascial tissue or like neural connections between the nodes.
Yeah.
And that's part of what you're talking about, the technological solution. It's both in the plan and also in the like, right, so
in the metacilium.
In the metacilium, like there's all these like with coral reef saving organizations, and they don't know how to talk to each other yet. And
they're also not talking to the rainforest organizations, and
right.
They're also not talking to the nuclear power organizations, and they're also not talking to the education organizations and the like.
And part of the deal that we're suggesting is that we'll like the framework of saying, hey, here's a more holistic plan provides the reason for doing that. Both like here's why it's needed and here's who to talk to in a certain sense. Like maybe not the specific agency, but if we're like, hey, look, you can't actually do coral reef preservation without dealing with real estate development.
Right.
Okay,
exactly.
buddy. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
Let's find out where we're going. 12
Is that it right there?
I've been to it before, and that might be it, but I don't think so.
What's the number?
What I had saved on my map was 12-9.